A very tall son named Barron. Has anyone ever heard of him?
At 19, Barron Trump has been living a high-profile life as the only child of U.S. President Donald Trump and Melania. He may not need the media to announce, but he's at the right age to cut ties with his mom, who is known to have complete control over his major decisions in life. This surprising move challenges the public's perception of the perfect image of a perfect family. Let's explore his revelations and what lies beneath the emotions of a young man trying to find his own path. The complicated relationship between Barron Trump and Melania, a closer look. When most people think of the Trump family, the first names that come to mind are usually Donald, Ivanka, or maybe even Eric. But in the background of all the headlines and media buzz stands Barron Trump, Donald and Melania Trump's only child together. Compared to the rest of the family, Barron has remained mostly out of the public eye, largely thanks to Melania's deliberate and protective approach to parenting. While the mother-son relationship appears strong on the surface, especially from the limited glimpses we've seen, it's clear that the dynamic between Melania and Barron is a complicated one, shaped by the intense spotlight of political life, strict privacy, and their unique roles in the Trump empire. From the very beginning, Melania made it clear that her number one priority was Barron. During Donald Trump's presidency, she famously delayed moving into the White House so that Barron could finish his school year in New York. That decision alone spoke volumes. It was a break from political tradition, and it showed that Melania was willing to buck expectations if it meant keeping Barron's life as stable as possible. It also set the tone for how she would handle motherhood in the public sphere. Fiercely private, unapologetically protective, and completely focused on her son's well-being. Yet, living under a microscope makes things tricky. Barron didn't just have to grow up, he had to grow up with America watching. That kind of pressure would be difficult for any child, and it's understandable that Melania went to great lengths to shield him. Reports often described her as hands-on and deeply involved in his upbringing, something not always seen among high-profile political families. But with that protectiveness comes a certain level of isolation. Barron wasn't often seen at public events, and when he was, his body language and expressions sometimes suggested discomfort or detachment. It makes you wonder what it's like to be a teenager with not only famous parents, but also parents with very specific public personas. His father being a polarizing political figure, and his mother known for her calm, reserved demeanor. Melania's background also plays a role in shaping their dynamic. Coming from Slovenia and having experienced a much more modest upbringing, she's often mentioned wanting Barron to be grounded, despite his father's fame and wealth. She reportedly spoke to him in Slovenian at home when he was younger, and emphasized manners and discipline. On one hand, that creates a strong foundation and shows how seriously she takes motherhood. On the other, it might have created a more formal tone to their relationship. There's a sense that Melania sees raising Barron not just as a personal duty, but almost as a mission, keeping him normal in a world that's anything but. Of course, we can't talk about the complications without mentioning Donald Trump himself. Melania often seemed to take on the role of mediator between Barron and his father, who is famously busy and frequently in the spotlight. While Donald has occasionally mentioned Barron in interviews, usually to note how tall or smart he is, it's Melania who appears to be the more emotionally involved parent. This dynamic could easily cause tension or create an imbalance in family life. Being the only child in such an unusual environment comes with its own pressures, and Melania's instinct to protect Barron may have also meant shouldering the emotional weight of the relationship on her own. In recent years, especially after the White House years, Melania has continued to keep Barron far away from the media. Even now, as Barron approaches adulthood, she reportedly remains heavily involved in his education and decisions about his future. It's rare to see a political kid with so little public presence, and that's largely due to Melania's strong control over his exposure. She's made it her mission to let him grow up in peace. But that also raises questions. Does this intense privacy make it harder for Barron to develop independence? Or is it the best gift a mother can give in such a strange and public life? Let's dive into possible reasons why Barron decides to distance himself from his mother. Personal differences. As Barron grows older and starts carving out his own identity, personal differences between him and Melania are bound to emerge, just like they do in almost every parent-child relationship. It's a natural part of growing up, but in their case, the stakes and pressures are arguably much higher. Melania has always been known for her poise, traditional values, and reserved nature. She's a product of a very different world, growing up in Slovenia under a more conservative, structured culture before stepping into the unpredictable and highly scrutinized life of American public figures. She's long been focused on discipline, privacy, and maintaining a dignified presence, especially when it comes to how her family is perceived. Those values have likely played a major role in how she raised Barron. However, teenagers and young adults don't always stick to the script their parents write. Barron, now approaching adulthood, may be starting to form his own opinions, shaped by peers, education, social media, and his own experiences. He's grown up in a completely different era and environment than his mother, one filled with constant digital connectivity, global cultural shifts, and a growing emphasis on individual expression. As he starts questioning the world and thinking independently, he might begin to see things differently than Melania does. He may not want the same rigid structure, the same privacy-first approach, or even the same values that Melania tried to instill in him. That's not necessarily a sign of rebellion. It's just the reality of a young person trying to figure out who they are. This kind of ideological or lifestyle tension isn't unusual in families, but when you add in the unique layers of politics, wealth, fame, and expectation, things get more complicated. What happens if Barron wants to take a public stance on an issue his mother would prefer he stay silent on? Or if he embraces a more outspoken, freewheeling identity, perhaps more like his father's? While Melania leans toward discretion and restraint, even simple things like his career choices, social life, or how much media exposure he's comfortable with could become points of disagreement. Melania has always guarded his privacy so tightly. If Barron begins to pull away from that protective shell, it could feel like a betrayal of sorts, or, at the very least, a loss of control. Moreover, Melania seems to hold a strong sense of tradition and loyalty, and as Barron gains independence, that bond might be tested. Will he continue to align with his family's public legacy, or will he try to chart a new path, one that distances him from his parents' reputations? These questions are still unfolding, but they highlight a potential source of emotional distance. Like many mothers, Melania has invested a huge part of her identity in raising her child. Watching him drift, whether emotionally, ideologically, or even physically, could be painful, even if it's completely natural. None of this means their relationship will fall apart. But as with any evolving parent-child bond, especially in high-pressure families, the path forward is rarely smooth. As Barron becomes more independent and starts making choices that reflect his own worldview rather than the one he was raised with, it could lead to some friction with Melania. And that friction, while normal, might feel more complicated given how close-knit and controlled their relationship has been up to this point. Political or family pressure. Another layer to the complexity of Barron and Melania's relationship is the sheer weight of political and family pressure. Let's be real, Being part of the Trump family isn't just about holiday dinners and birthday parties. It's like being part of a brand, a movement, and at times, a controversy magnet. That kind of legacy comes with a ton of expectations, both spoken and unspoken. Whether Barron wants it or not, the Trump name carries a reputation that stretches far beyond his control. And at some point, he'll have to decide whether he wants to carry that torch or walk away from it altogether. That decision, whatever it ends up being, could put him at odds with his family, and especially with Melania. While she has always been more private and less political than her husband, she's still deeply tied to that world. Her identity as a former First Lady, a public figure, and a fiercely loyal wife has shaped how she navigates life. If Barron decides that he wants to break from that legacy, to take a quieter route, or perhaps even a radically different one, it could feel like a rejection of everything his family stands for. And for Melania, who has poured so much effort into shielding him from negative press and protecting the Trump image, that might feel deeply personal. Imagine if Barron were to go into a field that openly criticizes the political world that his father helped shape, or if he simply wants nothing to do with politics at all. Even choosing a lifestyle that's more liberal, alternative, or culturally distinct from his parents' values could create emotional distance. Not necessarily because Melania wouldn't support him, but because it would challenge everything she's worked to preserve. The Trump name has become a symbol, loved by many, but equally disliked by others. For Barron, growing up under that banner might feel suffocating. And if he decides that he wants to redefine himself outside of it, part of that process might include putting space, emotional or even physical, between himself and the people most closely associated with that identity. There's also the issue of privacy. Melania has worked incredibly hard to keep Barron out of the spotlight. But what if he one day chooses to step into it on his own terms? What if he embraces social media, speaks out on issues, or simply wants to be more visible in a way that contradicts the quiet, guarded approach Melania has always taken? That kind of shift could lead to a clash, not just over values, but over control. Melania has spent years carefully managing how Barron is perceived. Watching him throw open the doors she's tried so hard to keep closed would likely be difficult for her. At the heart of it, there's a tension between legacy and individuality. Barron is growing up in the shadow of a political dynasty, and he may want to carve out his own identity, one that doesn't revolve around his last name. And while Melania might understand that, on a rational level, emotionally, it could create distance. Especially if Barron's pursuit of independence feels like a rejection of everything she's tried to protect him from. Or worse, everything she's tried to build for him. Not all complicated relationships are shaped by dramatic events or bold decisions. Sometimes it's the quiet, subtle things, the moments of emotional distance, misunderstandings, or unspoken tension that chip away at a connection over time. What could add up to Barron's list of cutting ties factors? Emotional or communication issues. In the case of Melania and Barron Trump, emotional or communication issues could play a significant role in how their relationship evolves. And that might be the most relatable part of their dynamic, despite their very public and privileged lives. When a parent and child spend years in a highly controlled environment, like the White House, for instance, it can create an emotional filter between them. Melania has always come across as calm, reserved, and even guarded. That kind of demeanor works well for protecting one's public image, but it can make open emotional communication more difficult, especially with a growing teen. Barron, like any young adult, is likely going through all kinds of internal changes, trying to make sense of who he is, what he believes, and how he fits into both his family and the world. If there's a lack of openness between him and his mother, or if he feels that she doesn't fully get him, it can lead to a growing emotional gap, that's hard to fix later on. Sometimes, parents and kids simply struggle to relate to one another. Melania's upbringing in a strict conservative European household and her experience navigating elite social circles is a far cry from the world Barron was born into, a world shaped by American pop culture, technology, and political fame. They might see things differently, process emotions differently, and express themselves in very different ways. If Barron is more emotionally expressive or curious about things Melania sees as off-limits or irrelevant, that difference alone could spark frustration or disconnect between them. Then there's the issue of unspoken conflict. Maybe there were moments in Barron's childhood when he felt overlooked, misunderstood, or even smothered by all the efforts to protect him. Maybe he resents the years of being kept out of the spotlight. Or perhaps he's frustrated by the image of him that's been shaped without his input. On the flip side, Melania might feel hurt if Barron doesn't appreciate the sacrifices she made, or if he begins to push her away now that he's getting older. If those emotions aren't talked about, or if they're dismissed or avoided, it's easy for resentment to quietly build. The result? A slow, subtle estrangement that doesn't stem from a major fight, but from years of not really connecting on a deeper level. These emotional or communication issues aren't unusual. They happen in all kinds of families, no matter how famous or wealthy. But in Barron and Melania's case, the pressure to maintain appearances might make it even harder to work through them. If you're constantly being watched or judged by the media and the public, there's less space to be vulnerable, to have hard conversations, or to admit when something isn't working. And without that vulnerability, emotional distance can start to feel permanent. That's what makes this part of their relationship particularly delicate. It's not about politics, public image, or even personal freedom. It's about whether they can truly see and hear each other as individuals. If they can maintain that emotional connection, they'll likely stay close, no matter how much Barron changes. But if communication breaks down and emotional walls go up, even the most protective mother can find herself on the outside looking in. Media and public scrutiny. Another critical piece in understanding the potential complexity of Barron and Melania Trump's relationship is the constant pressure of media and public scrutiny. Growing up in the spotlight isn't just uncomfortable. It can be emotionally exhausting. For Barron, life has always come with cameras flashing, headlines speculating, and social media dissecting even the smallest glimpse of his existence. While Melania has worked hard to shield him from the public eye, the reality is that as the child of a former president and first lady, complete privacy was never truly an option. Over time, the effects of living under that microscope can be draining, especially for a young person still trying to figure out who they are. Every public appearance is analyzed, every expression overinterpreted. Even in his teens, Barron has been the subject of memes, tabloid rumors, and viral photos, often without any context or fairness. That's a lot for any kid to absorb, and it's not hard to imagine how he might internalize that exposure as something forced on him. If he feels like his mother didn't do enough to protect him from it, or worse, if he believes she allowed it to happen to maintain a certain public image, it could lead to deep-rooted resentment. To Melania's credit, she has arguably been more protective of Barron than most political figures' spouses. She rarely allowed him to attend public events, kept him out of interviews, and worked to keep his private life exactly that, private. But from Barron's perspective, especially as he grows older, those efforts might not feel like enough. Sometimes, it's not just about what a parent does. It's also about how the child experiences it. If Barron ever felt like decisions were made about his life without his input, or that his feelings about the spotlight were ignored for the sake of appearances, it could leave behind emotional scars. The media circus surrounding the Trump family has been particularly intense and divisive. Being a Trump comes with automatic attention, some of it fawning, much of it critical, and almost all of it relentless. That kind of fame is different from celebrity. It's political, polarizing, and often cruel. And while Melania tried to act as a buffer, it's entirely possible that Barron, especially in his more impressionable years, felt exposed and vulnerable anyway. He may associate that public exposure with stress, anxiety, or even embarrassment. And if he connects those feelings to his mother's decisions, even unintentionally, it could strain their relationship. There's also the long-term psychological impact of being seen but not really known. Barron has been discussed endlessly online, but very little is actually known about him. That disconnect, being publicly visible but personally invisible, can be incredibly alienating. If he comes to resent the narrative that's been built around him, or the silence from his parents in response to rumors or misinformation that could lead to emotional distance, he might feel like his mother was too quiet when it mattered, or that her silence was a form of complicity. If Barron has existing issues with his mother, is it safe to say he's more likely to drift away from his dad, too? Barron and his U.S. chief father. Barron is the youngest of Donald's children, and he grew up surrounded by the intense spotlight of the Trump family's fame and political drama. Unlike his older siblings, who have been more outspoken and visible in the media, Barron has mostly stayed quiet and out of the public eye, which makes their relationship feel a little different. One of the biggest factors in their dynamic is the difference in how they live their lives. Donald Trump's world is loud and fast-paced, full of business deals, political rallies, and non-stop media coverage. Barron, on the other hand, has largely lived a more private and low-key life. When Donald was president, Barron had to adjust to living in the White House, attending school in Washington, D.C., and dealing with all the attention that came along with being the president's son. For a kid trying to just be normal, that's a lot to handle. This contrast between Donald's very public life and Barron's quieter existence likely shaped how close, or how distant, they are. Another thing that makes their relationship complicated is the amount of time Donald was away from home, especially during his presidency. It's pretty common for any kid to feel a little distant from a parent who's traveling or working long hours, and that's probably true for Barron too. When you add the constant media scrutiny, political controversies, and public criticism that surrounded Donald Trump, it probably made their family life even more stressful. Barron had to grow up in a very unusual environment where even private moments could end up being public fodder. Despite all these challenges, it's clear that Donald cares about Barron. Over the years, Donald has shared photos and stories about Barron, showing pride in his son's achievements and milestones. From celebrating birthdays to mentioning Barron's interests, like his love for sports and soccer, Donald has shown a softer, more personal side. It's worth noting that Barron seems to have a good relationship with his mother, Melania, too, and that family support likely plays a big role in his life. Some observers have speculated about whether Barron and Donald are emotionally close, or if there's distance between them, but that's hard to judge from the outside. Every family has its ups and downs, and parenting in the public eye is no easy task. What's important is that Barron has been able to maintain a relatively normal childhood despite the chaos around him, and as he grows older, their relationship will probably continue to evolve. With or without his influential parents, Barron will surely build a strong future if he continues to work on it. The Endgame. Born in 2006 to Donald and Melania Trump, Barron entered the world under a blinding spotlight. From infancy, he was surrounded by towering expectations, and heavy symbolism. The only child of a future U.S. president and a former model, living in a golden New York penthouse before spending part of his youth in the White House. Most American kids don't grow up with Secret Service agents trailing behind them or media outlets analyzing their body language at public events. Barron's life has been anything but typical. But despite all this exposure, Barron has remained unusually private for someone so high-profile. While his half-siblings, Don Jr., Ivanka, Eric, and even Tiffany, have all leaned into public life to varying degrees, Barron has stayed in the background, largely silent. And perhaps that's by design. His mother, Melania, has been famously protective of him, often shielding him from the media and stressing the importance of letting him have a normal childhood as much as that's possible in his position. Still, silence breeds curiosity. What does he think? What does he want? And where does he go from here? Let's imagine the first and most obvious path: politics. Barron has a last name that carries enormous weight in certain corners of the U.S., and with the rise of political dynasties across generations, from the Kennedys and Bushes to the Clintons, it wouldn't be entirely out of the question for him to eventually throw his hat into the ring. Some supporters of Donald Trump have already floated the idea, half-jokingly, of Barron 2044, a sort of sequel to Trump's populist rise, but with a younger, maybe more modern spin. In this version of the future, Barron steps forward as a next-gen political figure, less combative than his father, more refined in tone, but still drawing on the same base of support. Imagine a candidate who grew up around power, wealth, and policy, but who also had the digital fluency and cultural awareness to connect with younger voters. Maybe Barron would use his unique position to try and bridge the massive divide in American politics, positioning himself as someone who understands both the elite and the everyday. But that path comes with baggage. Politics is brutal, especially in the Trump era. Stepping into that arena would mean reliving the controversies of his father's presidency, being held accountable for things he never said or did, and constantly facing skepticism about whether he's leading or simply inheriting. There's also the psychological toll. Public scrutiny is relentless, and Barron has already spent most of his life being watched. Would he really want to walk right back into that fire? The answer might be a resounding no. Which brings us to the second possibility: a life away from politics entirely. This is the scenario where Barron Trump turns away from public life and charts a quieter, more personal course. Maybe he goes to college. There have been reports and speculation about universities like NYU or even overseas institutions, and studies something totally unrelated to politics or business. Philosophy, architecture, sports science, digital design? Who knows? Maybe he's a writer, an academic, a private tech entrepreneur who values ideas over attention. That would be a powerful rejection of the Trump brand's loud, larger-than-life persona. It's not hard to picture a future where Barron avoids media, avoids social platforms, and lives more like an average, wealthy young adult, pursuing passions out of view, letting the noise pass him by. This version of his future is appealing not because it's ordinary, but because it feels like a form of resistance. Growing up in the spotlight often causes children to either embrace it or run from it. If Barron turns his back on fame, he wouldn't be the first. Plenty of children of celebrities and political figures have done exactly that. And honestly, there's something poetic about the idea of the quietest Trump ending up with the most grounded and peaceful life. In a world obsessed with attention, maybe the boldest move is opting out. Then there's the third, and arguably most contemporary option: a hybrid path built around influence, entrepreneurship, and digital identity. Today's world doesn't require someone to run for office or launch a corporate empire to make a name for themselves. Influence now happens through TikTok, YouTube, startups, podcast networks, and media brands. Barron is a Gen Z digital native. He's growing up in the age of Mr. Beast, Elon Musk, and Emma Chamberlain, where young people are building empires online and redefining fame and relevance. He could tap into this world not just because of who he is, but because of what he might want to say or do. Imagine Barron launching a documentary series about growing up under political scrutiny, or a fashion line, or a think tank focused on youth policy and digital rights. There are countless ways he could reimagine what it means to be a Trump in the 21st century. But to succeed in that world, authenticity is everything. Social media doesn't reward pretense. It rewards vulnerability, voice, and vision. If Barron chooses this route, he'll need to find something real to say. Something that resonates not just because of his last name, but because of his insight. And maybe, after years of enforced privacy, he'll have something meaningful to contribute. The most compelling potential future for Barron Trump might not be about politics, business, or influence. It might be about freedom, the freedom to choose his own path, on his own timeline, with his own values. Being born into a legacy family can be both a burden and a springboard. There's always the risk of being defined by what came before you, but there's also the rare opportunity to rewrite the story entirely. Barron's greatest potential may lie not in mimicking or rejecting his father, but in moving beyond the shadow altogether, building something quieter, smarter, and uniquely his. He's still young. There's plenty of time. And if we've learned anything from history, it's that the most interesting people are often the ones no one saw coming. Can Barron make it without his mother? Write your comments below and subscribe to the channel for more.